When Atlas Fallen: Reign of Sand launched with ambitious promises of revolutionizing the action RPG genre with its unique sand manipulation mechanics and vast open world, expectations were understandably high. Developed by Deck 13 Interactive, the studio behind the Surge series, and published by Focus Entertainment, Atlas Fallen seemed positioned to carve out its own niche in the crowded gaming landscape. Yet, despite its promising premise and the pedigree of its creators, the game stumbled dramatically, failing to connect with audiences and critics alike. What went wrong with this sandy adventure? Let's try to understand why Atlas Fallen ultimately crumbled under the weight of its own ambitions.
Yes, it happens again.
On paper, Atlas Fallen had everything going for it. A unique setting inspired by Egyptian mythology, but with its own distinct flavor, innovative gameplay mechanics centered around manipulating sand as both weapon and traversal tool, and a narrative about overthrowing tyrannical gods. The core concept, a world consumed by sand where players would harness that very element to become increasingly powerful, was genuinely intriguing. Players took on the role of a Nameless, an outcast forced to wear a degrading mask, who discovers an ancient gauntlet capable of controlling sand. This artifact, the Essence Stone, grants its wielder extraordinary powers, setting them on a collision course with the oppressive sun deity Thelos and his enforcers. Its premise ripe with potential, combining elements of God of War's Dyside with Prince of Persia's sand manipulation and the open-world structure of modern action RPGs. So why didn't this concept translate into an engaging experience? Perhaps the most damning criticism of Atlas Fallen was its lack of identity. Despite being set in a world consumed by sand, the environments failed to leave a lasting impression. Areas blended together in a monotonous beige palette, lacking the landmark-based navigation and environmental storytelling that make great open worlds memorable. Compare this to other desert-focused games like Journey, which created an emotionally resonant experience with minimal elements, or Mad Max, which turned post-apocalyptic wasteland into a character itself. Atlas Fallen's world, by contrast, felt procedurally generated rather than lovingly created, with copy-pasted ruins and settlements that give players little reason to explore beyond checking off map markers. When your game's distinguishing feature is sand, you need to make that sand interesting, something Atlas Fallen never quite figured out how to do. Because if you've seen one sand dune in Atlas Fallen, you've seen them all, and you'll see them all, repeatedly.
Another anvil there beneath that rock formation. This place will serve as a landmark.
The combat system in Atlas Fallen represents one of its greatest missed opportunities. The foundation was really solid, momentum-based fighting where stringing together attacks builds up a momentum meter that enhances your abilities and unlocks more powerful moves. Players could shapeshift their weapons mid-combo, transitioning between hammers, whips, and gauntlets to adapt to different enemy types. This sounds excellent. In practice, it suffered from numerous issues. First, floaty, imprecise hit detection that made combat feel disconnected. Second, overly simple enemy AI that rarely required tactical thinking. Third, a camera that frequently lost track of the action during intense moments. And finally, inconsistent difficulty spikes that felt more frustrating than challenging. The sand powers, which should have been the game's defining nature, often felt like afterthoughts in combat rather than integral components. Sand surfing to quickly traverse the environment was genuinely fun, but the combat applications of sand manipulation never evolved beyond basic attacks and defensive maneuvers. Atlas Fallen gives you godlike sand powers, then mostly asks you to hit things with slightly sandy hammers. No discussion of Atlas Fallen's failure would be complete without addressing its technical problems at launch. The game was plagued by performance issues across all platforms. First, frame rate drops during combat and while traversing the open world. Second, texture popping that became increasingly distracting, loading times between areas, collision detection problems causing players to fall through the world, and finally, quest-breaking bugs that forced restarts. While some of these issues were eventually patched, the damage was already done. In today's competitive gaming market, first impressions matter enormously, and Atlas Fallen's technical shortcomings significantly undermine player confidence in the product. Perhaps most telling was the game's performance on last-gen consoles, where frame rate frequently dipped below 20 FPS during intense combat scenarios, essentially rendering the game's supposedly fluid combat system unplayable. This suggested a fundamental mismatch between the game's ambitions and the technical resource allocated to its development.
Every day they die, killed by sand wraiths or the whips of their masters. Every day. And yet Thelos remains indifferent. This endless cycle will persist into eternity, unless someone were to rise from the storm.
Atlas Fallen attempted to tell a story of rebellion against oppressive gods, exploring themes of identity, the protagonist being literally the nameless, and the corrupting influence of power. These are compelling themes that have served as foundations for many beloved RPGs. Unfortunately, the execution left much to be desired. The narrative suffered from several critical flaws. First, its generic characters and dialogue. The characters populating Atlas Fallen's world rarely transcended their archetypes. The supportive mentor, the reluctant ally, the power-hungry villain, all were present, but none were developed with enough nuance to become memorable. Dialogue was functional at best and cringe-inducing at worst, with exposition frequently delivered through lengthy, unskippable conversations that halted the game's pace. In reality, I've had more emotionally engaging conversations with my GPS than with any NPC in Atlas Fallen.
Do you need help?
Yes. Oh yes. Our job is to gather food. They jump from the people depend on. Please.
I will.
Please.
On the western side?
That is wonderful news. Sadly, I will.
Tell me,
We have lost so much. Your help gathering them.
what plants do you need?
All we and. Greetings.
They're right here.
They're beautiful. Here.
Second, predictable plot development. The storyline followed a disappointingly linear and predictable path. Anyone who has played an action RPG in the past decade could anticipate every twist long before it occurred. The corrupt deity, the betrayal by a trusted ally, the discovery of the protagonist's hidden lineage, all standard tropes that Atlas Fallen did little to subvert or reimagine. And finally, disjointed pacing. Perhaps the most damaging narrative issue was the game's pacing. Main story missions often required players to complete numerous side activities before progressing, artificially extending the game's length at the cost of narrative momentum. This stop-start rhythm prevented the story from building any sense of urgency or emotional investment.
Shard, your resolve is impressive, but more need to be found.
Underlying many of Atlas Fallen's problems was a fundamental identity crisis. The game tried to be too many things at once, like an open-world adventure like Horizon Zero Dawn, a stylish action combat game like Devil May Cry, a mythological epic like God of War, a loot-driven RPG like Diablo, a traversal-focused experience like Marvel's Spider-Man but with sand. In attempting to incorporate elements from all of these successful formulas, Atlas Fallen failed to excel at any of them. The open world lacked the density and discovery of the best examples in the genre. The combat, while flashy, lacked the depth and precision of dedicated action games. The mythological story wasn't given enough room to breathe and develop. The loot system felt tacked on rather than integral to the experience. In total, Atlas Fallen wants to be everything to everyone and ends up being nothing special to anyone. The lack of focus manifested in a game that felt like it was designed by a committee, with different systems pulling in different directions rather than working in harmony toward a unified vision. The result was a disjointed experience that never quite found its footing. Atlas Fallen's failure wasn't entirely due to its inherent qualities as a game. External factors, particularly its marketing and release timing, contributed significantly to its underwhelming reception. Atlas Fallen launched in August 2023, a particularly crowded period for gaming releases, coming just weeks after major titles like Baldur's Gate 3 and Armored Core 6: Fires of Rubicon, and shortly before the highly anticipated Starfield. Atlas Fallen struggled to capture the attention of gaming audiences and media outlets. For a new IP without an established fanbase, release timing is crucial, and Atlas Fallen's launch window did it no favors. The game was effectively sandwiched between higher-profile releases, making it difficult for this unproven title to gain any meaningful traction. The marketing for Atlas Fallen never successfully communicated what made the game special. Trailers focused on visual spectacle and combat without clearly explaining the game's unique selling points or what would set it apart from other action RPGs. This lack of clear identity in marketing materials reflected the game's internal identity crisis. When potential players couldn't easily articulate what Atlas Fallen was offering that they couldn't get elsewhere, many simply opted to pass on the experience entirely. Because if you cannot explain your game's unique appeal in one sentence, you are already fighting an uphill battle.
This shard is protected. There should be more ceiling totems nearby. Look around. Try to trace their connections.
At launch, Atlas Fallen was priced at $59.99, the standard price point for AAA releases. This positioning set expectations accordingly, placing the game in direct comparison with other full-price titles from much larger studios with significantly more resources. While pricing is always a complex decision involving numerous factors, the reality is that many players felt Atlas Fallen didn't offer enough content or polish to justify its premium price tag, especially when compared to contemporaries like Baldur's Gate 3, which, despite its objective differences, offered vastly more content and production value for the same price. The rapid discounting of the game just weeks after launch seemed to confirm these suspicions, but by then the damage to consumer perception had been done. As the saying goes in gaming, never buy at launch what will be half price in a month, a lesson many players applied to Atlas Fallen, further hurting its commercial performance. Perhaps the most frustrating aspect of Atlas Fallen's failure is glimpsing the better game that could have existed with different decisions or priorities. First, better focus on sand mechanics, as the sand manipulation mechanics were the game's most distinctive feature, yet they felt underutilized throughout the experience. A more focused game, built entirely around these mechanics, perhaps in a smaller, more dense world, might have resulted in a more cohesive and memorable experience. Despite its fantasy desert setting, Atlas Fallen never established a distinctive visual language to set it apart from other games. A stronger artistic direction, perhaps leaning into a more stylized approach rather than attempted photorealism, could have helped the game stand out and overcome some of its technical limitations. By trying to create a vast open world with numerous systems, Atlas Fallen spread its resources too thin. A more concentrated experience, either focusing on combat excellence, environmental storytelling, or narrative depth, might have allowed the developers to polish one aspect to true excellence rather than achieving mediocrity across multiple fronts. But overall, despite its failures, Atlas Fallen deserves recognition for its ambition. Attempting to create a new IP with unique mechanics in the action RPG space is no small undertaking, and the developers clearly put passion in the project. That this passion didn't translate into a successful game speaks not necessarily to a lack of talent or effort, effort, but to the immense challenges of modern game development and the increasingly high bar for success. Just like its protagonist Manipulate and Sand, Atlas Fallen tried to shape itself into something magnificent, but ultimately couldn't prevent that sand from slipping through fingers. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of Atlas Fallen isn't that it was terrible, because it wasn't, but it was really forgettable. In an industry where even spectacular failures can achieve cult status through their ambition or uniqueness, being forgotten is perhaps the cruelest fate of all. Atlas Fallen Reign of Sand may have failed to leave its mark on the gaming landscape, but the lessons from its stumbles will hopefully help future games with similar ambitions avoid the same quicksand.